Hey friends, hope everybody's doing well. So I've got this picture of Easter Island I'm going to be working from today. It's kind of a different take on this place. Usually when you see pictures of this place, the main focus is the Moai statues, which you can see in the middle left of the photo. And then you've got this big megalithic structure that kind of comes up the hill towards the viewer. Then you've got the ocean on the left, and those nice dark hills in the background, and a sky with some pretty simple clouds. This is a very powerful scene, and I like that the Moai are still a part of the scene, but they're not the main focus. I like how this picture puts them into perspective and into context in their environment. A friend of mine actually took this picture, and this painting is going to be for him. So I will try to do it justice. Now, the first thing I did was a value study, which is always the first thing I do whenever I'm doing a scene like this, or basically any other scene. So what I'm doing with this value study is breaking the scene into 3 values: light, middle, and dark. And the lightest values are represented by the white of the paper. Middle value I've represented with this middle value wash of Payne's gray, and then the dark values, again, Payne's gray, just a thicker mixture of paint. And by breaking the scene up into only 3 values, I'm forced to lump values in the photo together to simplify the scene, because if I tried to paint every single little tiny gradient and value that's in the photo, I would go insane. I would be here all day just trying to get every tiny detail right. And what I want is for my painting to feel loose and free and spontaneous. So the value study helps me plan out my painting ahead of time before I actually start painting the color version. So one benefit is simplifying the scene into 3 values. Gives me a lot less to think about. Another benefit is I've already painted the scene once ahead of time, because I do my value studies with paint instead of pencil like some people do. It's kind of a practice run for the painting. Now really all I have to do is follow this value study, only do it in color. So you can see another thing that I've done is find one big connected shape in this middle value range. All of these middle value pieces are touching each other, except for the parts on top of the hill for those trees. And then within that middle value shape, I've darkened a few areas, like these moai are going to be darker. The shadow side of this rock wall is going to be darker. Some of these rocks are going to be darker, these ones too. Mostly stuff in the foreground is going to be darker, and that will help bring the foreground closer and push the background farther back. And there's a few other tricks we can use to create that sense of depth and distance, which we will get into in a minute. So there's the value study, there's my roadmap. This is my guide for how to do this painting. Takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Makes watercolor can be very stressful if you don't have a plan, but if you have a plan, which is what the value study is, then it's a lot more fun and enjoyable. So, as always, I'm going to wet down both sides of my paper. I should mention that before I do this, I very lightly go over with my eraser over some of the darker pencil lines to kind of get rid of some of that excess graphite, because if you don't do that, once you run the sponge over the paper, it can kind of smudge the graphite. It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it just cleans things up a little bit if you do that. I'm going to get rid of some of that excess water on this side of the paper. Just squeeze out the water of the sponge and then lightly run it over the surface. I don't need it to be completely soaking wet, just need it to be damp. And the reason for wetting both sides of the paper is, as you can see, it's laying flat on the board. I don't need to tape it down. And it also stays wet for longer and allows me to work wet into wet for a longer period of time. And the first wash is always about wet into wet and fuzzy shapes, flowing shapes. Everything is bleeding and flowing into itself. We're going to get started with that right now. First wash is about the lightest colors, including white, which there's going to be a few very simple clouds in the sky. There's a lot less sky in my actual composition than the photo. I've kind of moved things up a little bit. I think it looks a little more balanced that way. Kind of following the rule of thirds, where you've got a third there and then 2/3 at the bottom. It's kind of one of those simple rules of composition. So I've got this nice big palette here with a huge mixing area to use. So I'm going to mix up a nice big old puddle of sky color. Cerulean blue, cobalt turquoise light, just a little bit of turquoise light in there. I find that usually gives me a nice satisfying sky color. Let's start at the top. I think that looks pretty good. And there's another benefit of having that nice wet paper. You see how smooth that paint looks when I put it down. Nice and smooth. And we'll just drop in some clouds here and there. I'm not really going to honor the photo too much with the clouds because the clouds are more of a supplementary item in this painting, but it's kind of a nice little piece of eye candy. There's some fluffy clouds, fluffy tropical clouds. We'll probably paint through this hillside. And then as we get lower to the horizon, I'm going to smudge the bottom of that right there with a mostly clean brush. Add a little bit more of that turquoise light in there. Get rid of some of the excess water on my brush. That's what this rag is for. It's for controlling the wetness of the brush. It's just an old wash rag. And just bring that down. I'll just paint that right into the ocean too. The ocean is going to be middle value, so don't really need to worry about that for the moment. This hill is also going to be middle value. Same with the shadow side of this hill. The top of this hill is going to be light value, and I'm going to come back in a little bit once this is more dry to drop some of that green in there. I can start toning the color of this hillside because there's a few patches of green that are going to be popping through once I put the middle value on top of it. So let's go ahead and mix up a nice green color. We're going to keep this blue on the palette, all this nice blue. We're going to mix that ultramarine around. Oh, look at all this space I have to work with. It's my first time using this big palette. It feels so much more spacious, less cramped. It's so nice. It's going to take some getting used to. All my paint is so far away. So grabbing some yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, just to vibrant it up a little bit. Vibrant it up? Is that a word? It is now. The green in this photo is so saturated and just bright. I'm not going to go that hard with the green, though, in the painting. I want it to be just a little more subdued because I think it will read better. Yeah, something like that. make it a little more blue because this hill is so far away. And then as the green comes closer towards the foreground, we will add some more yellow into it to lighten it up and warm it up. So all of this color is, well, most of it is going to get painted over in the second wash, but I'm just toning the underside, or I'm toning the paint that's going underneath the middle value, because that's what's going to show through. Paper's getting a little dry, so I'm just going to spray it down. Getting a little ridge on the front of the paper, so right there, if you can see that, so I can just lift this up and spray the back side of that ridge, and usually it flattens it out just like that. Again, not the biggest deal in the world, but I really want my paper to stay flat. It just makes everything easier for me. Right, so just playing around with this mixture of green colors here, trying to get it a little more, just a little more yellow as it comes into the foreground. Painting right through these statues, because it's all going to get painted over. Same with these rocks, it's all going to get painted over. Okay, more yellow. The mixture is just slowly getting more and more yellow, heavy. More yellow-green as it comes forward. It's a really subtle effect. It's almost not even noticeable, but it just makes things look a little more realistic. And there's some other subtle colors happening in the grass. There's some reddish browns here and there that I can drop in once I finish with these greens. And the brightest greens, the warmest greens, right up towards the front there. First wash is almost done. We're not worrying about any kind of detail work in the first wash. It's all very impressionistic and loose and blossoming and flowing. Letting watercolor do one of the things it does best, which is flow. Allowing it to paint itself in a way. So let's see, what do I want to do for some of those interesting variations in this green? I can take some of this red maybe and just drop it into that green area. Something like that. And just kind of throw it in here and there. Add a little bit of interest and variety, so it's not just flat green. Another thing that helps scenes like this where it's just a grassy hill that goes back into the distance, helps it look more realistic if you add little variations like this here and there. And I'm using the photo as inspiration for where I can put these variations. just here and there. Very, very subtle. Something about like that, I think, will be good. Just cleaning off my brush. I'm gonna paint the top of that hill in the background. Mix up a more blue, yellow. Just get rid of some of that excess water on this brush. Even though the color of this hill in the photo is quite warm, I'm exaggerating the blueness of it to make it appear as though it's farther away than it actually is, creating the illusion of depth on a two-dimensional piece of paper. It's really what it comes down to. So, looks like the first wash is done. So I need to let this paper dry up a little bit. Then we'll get started with the second wash. So stay right there, I'll be right back. Okay, so I've mixed up a few puddles here. I've got some color for the distant cliffs, and then I've got another color here for the ocean. And this cliff here is dry enough to start working on, so we'll just drop that in. It's okay if it fuzzes a little bit. That actually will help it appear more distant. Fuzzy and kind of indistinct. And that ocean is a little too wet. I need this to be more dry because I need to paint around these waves. And if the paper's too wet, the paint will bloom like you see happening right here. Which in this case is what I wanted to happen. But I don't want that to happen here, so I need the paper to dry out more. You've always got to be watching your dryness and your wetness and which areas are dry, which are wet still. Very important with watercolor is the timing of everything. So, let's see about this cliff. Need to cool that gray down a little bit. I usually use ultramarine blue and burnt umber for my grays. You can also use cobalt blue and burnt umber, or either of these two blues and burnt sienna. I find that they make pretty nice grays. So we're just dropping in the shadow side of this sea cliff here. While the paint is still relatively damp. Again, giving it that fuzzy and indistinct and distant look that I'm going for. And I'm kind of playing around with warm and cool, different variations of gray in this cliffside. Painting right through these statues. Because remember, these are going to end up being dark value. So you can just paint right through them. Anything that's going to be darker than the paint you're putting on now, you can just paint through it. Unless you're trying to preserve pure white, like these clouds. Really not too concerned with getting all the details of this hill exactly right. because it's not the focus of this painting. Just enough detail to make it interesting and to get the point across is all you need. I think that looks pretty good. I might end up darkening a few of these areas as it dries. And I want to put those trees up on top. Just dropping in a little smudge and letting the paint bloom. I'm literally letting these trees paint themselves. If you learn to work with watercolor instead of trying to fight it, you can do things like that. And that's just a matter of practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing and trying different things and just gaining an understanding of what this medium does and why it does it. I want to fuzz off. Fuzz off. That's a funny saying. I'm going to fuzz the top of this like that. Maybe make it look a little hazy and indistinct. Yeah, I like that. So the way you can fuzz things is by using a clean, damp brush. Damp, not wet, and then just lightly scrubbing. You can also use that to lift paint up, like right here, if I want to make it look a little misty. Like that. Just a little bit. Just lift up a little bit of paint with that clean, damp brush. You can also use this for smoothing edges and blending. That ocean I think is still too wet. We'll just start painting in some of the shadow areas in the foreground. I think we might be dry enough to do that. Painting in those moai statues. And you see how these statues are directly connected to the shadow of this hill, which is connected to this hill back here. It's all one big shape. That makes it read very powerfully from a distance. If you're standing back and looking at it on a wall, you can tell exactly what's going on, at least hopefully that's the idea. Simple is powerful. So, referencing my value study, trying to stay loose, telling myself to stay loose, stay loose, stay loose. Don't get caught up in the details. At least not yet. And if you are going to get caught up in the details, make sure you know exactly where those details are going to be ahead of time. Because if you overwork details, you can ruin your painting. And it can happen so fast. You wouldn't even believe how fast that can happen. You just lose track of everything. Just working details because it's so fun. It's so fun to work on details. And obviously there's a time and a place for details, but just like I said, know where that's going. Be very intentional about it, and that's where the value study is so helpful, because that's forcing you to decide where are the details going to go, where are the mid values going, where are the darks going. That way you're not guessing and kind of just painting blindly, so to speak. Rocks going down into that sea foam. Looks really nice. This always seemed like such a magical place to me. Would love to visit someday. Easter Island, also known as Isla de la Pascua, is owned by Ecuador, which is interesting because it's a Polynesian island owned by Ecuador. I guess the United States owns Hawaii, so it's really not that different. Whether that should be the case or not is a topic for a different YouTube video on a different channel. Here we're just admiring the place as it is, for what it is. Yeah, so see how I'm able to paint in this area of where the waves are, and the edges are very sharp and hard and defined, as opposed to this area here, which is fuzzy and indistinct. That's because I let the paper dry. So painting wet onto dry is how you get those really razor sharp edges. And for me, it's the contrast between those perfectly soft edges and those razor hard, razor sharp edges. That's one of the things that makes watercolor so magical for me, is the combination of being able to do both of those things effortlessly. And you can get these perfect gradients between colors because the color is mixing itself on the paper, because it's flowing, because it's water. Oil cannot mix itself. Acrylic cannot mix itself. That's why watercolor is highly unique and very difficult to imitate in other mediums. I've seen it done before, and it's always amazing that people can even come close to make an acrylic look like a watercolor, but might as well just learn to paint watercolor if you're going to do that. Do the real thing. To each their own, I suppose. And if you're watching this video, I assume you're at least interested in learning how to paint, so hopefully I can do my small part to help you along in that process. So my eyes are bouncing back and forth between my reference photo and my value study. I'm using both simultaneously. And these are just indications of these little rocks and stuff in the grass. Just all in this gray color for now. I'm mixing it up and adding more colors into it every now and then. I'll tell you, working on a small palette gets you really used to constantly dipping back into colors and mixing, because I'm doing that right now even though I don't actually need to. But on a small palette you just have no space to work, so you have to constantly mix and mix and mix, and it just gets you good at mixing really quick, which is something I'm just finding out right now. Some rocks and stuff over here. And I am probably going to come back after this is all dry and add just some texture to this grass, maybe make the green more vibrant, at least right here. And beyond that, it'll basically remain the same. It's just looking a little too dull. And there's nothing wrong with doing a glaze and darkening things up if they need to be. I've saved many paintings by doing glazes. I try to avoid glazing if I can because I want to get it right the first time, but that's just not possible sometimes. With enough practice, I'm sure it is. But I'm not at the level yet where I can just get the values of every single thing right on the very first try. I'm way better than I used to be. But I'm always learning something. I really don't think it matters how experienced you are with this medium. You always learn something with every painting you do. It's very humbling. Watercolor will not let you get a big head. It just won't. It will not let you do it. Just when you think you have it figured out, watercolor says, "Oh, you think so, do you? You think you got me figured out? Well, watch this." And then you're like, "Whoa, didn't think that was going to happen." But those unexpected moments of when things pop up and things kind of go awry, that's where the magic is. The unexpected things that happen when you're painting that you can't predict. How you handle those moments and what you decide to do with them is very important, because they can be opportunities if you think about it the right way. So we've got this big megalithic structure. I really need to figure out what this is. It's kind of like it looks like a ramp. And there's like all these rocks and lines, and I'm trying to very, very loosely and impressionistically indicate that. And I tried to do that in the value study. I kind of played around with some ideas of how I could depict this without being too fussy. When I try to draw a broken line like that, and maybe just one more next to it, and then I can kind of just lightly indicate some other of those lines here and there, smudge it up here and there. I just think that's a really interesting feature of this place. No idea what it is or what it was for, no idea, but it looks really amazing. So, the bare minimum amount of detail to get the idea across is my goal. It just keeps things loose. I almost want it to look something, well, maybe not look like a sketch, but have sketch energy, if that makes sense. Like, oh, it looks spontaneous and like it was painted in the moment. There's an energy and a movement to it that I just really find satisfying. I don't want to be a stiff painter, which is definitely what I used to be, and still am sometimes. Still trying to break the habit. Again, learning all the time. There's just some cool textures right here that I want to brush in real quick, just dry brushing. That ought to do it. So we can paint the ocean now. I've already got that color mixed. Another advantage of having a big giant palette is you can mix colors ahead of time. It's a really beautiful color. Leave some white areas here and there, indicating waves. Mixing it into this gray a little as it comes forward, just darkening it up. Being very careful where I put my brush. Being very intentional. I'm not just randomly flopping it all over the place. I know exactly where my brush is going to go and what it's going to do when it gets there. So I'm just very impressionistically painting these waves. Bring that down right over to the top of these rocks. A lot of these will get painted over again in the darker values, so I can just paint through them at least a little bit. It's kind of a catch-22 in that in order to paint in a way that appears loose, you actually have to slow down and be more intentional and careful so that you get the brushstroke right in one go and you don't have to keep going back and messing with it. The fewer brushstrokes on top of themselves that you can have, the fresher and cleaner your painting will look. It takes a while to get to that point, but you can definitely do it. I learned how to do it, so you can do it. I started from zero, barely knew how to draw. Didn't know which colors you mix to make green. I knew nothing. And I just watched videos and followed along with art tutorials like the one I'm making and eventually learned. So I added some cobalt blue into this mixture and then I'm just dropping it in here and there, and that kind of gives you a little very subtle hint of like the texture of waves. Gives them just a tiny bit of shape. Now let's see. I think we can start adding some of these darks in there. At least in the areas that are dry enough. So, makes it a more intense gray, thicker mixture, more paint than water. Just makes a big giant puddle of that. I just need to make sure things are dry enough to actually go dark. Because I can't have the tops of these statues bleeding into the hillside. I need them to be crisp. Like you see here, the tops of the statues are a hard edge. If this area is still wet and I try to paint these statues, the top of the paint is going to fuzz and smudge just like this. So I need to make sure the paint underneath is dry. And I think it's dry enough, so I can still see my pencil marks underneath there. I needed to make sure that they were dark enough to be seen under middle value paint. So even in the sketching phase, you got to be thinking about what the painting is going to look like and the different phases and steps involved. It's fuzzing just a little bit, but don't think it'll be an issue. It's adding just a tiny touch of randomness at the edge, which I always love. Yeah, I think this is going to be a personal favorite of mine. I wish I was keeping it and not giving it to my friend. Never really painted a scene like this of a ancient megalithic site. It's pretty interesting. I might do more of these. What do you think? Should I try to paint Machu Picchu? Let me know in the comments. Yeah. So that's making the shadow side of this platform stand out. It suddenly has a shape. It suddenly has three-dimensionality, where it didn't before. Before it was just a dark smudge. Kind of tapping my brush around for these stones. Then we'll darken up the shadow side of this wall also. Adding a little texture to some of these rocks. And this is all exactly what I have in my value study. I already know where I need to add darks. I don't have to guess at it and look back and forth at my photo and my painting. I can just kind of paint. I can just go. I need to wait to add darks here so it doesn't bleed up into the ocean. Okay, so I mixed up a more vibrant green, and I'm just going to glaze over this whole area. I'm leaving a few dry brush marks here and there, kind of give the grass a more sparkly look, a little bit of a shiny texture. Yeah, that already looks way, way, way better. In fact, that's just about done. Probably drop some birds into the sky. Maybe right here. Yeah, it kind of looks like there's a flock flying towards you from the distance. Yeah, I like that effect. That's really cool. That hill should be darker too. Alright, and there you have it. There's a finished painting. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you learned something. Hopefully I'll see you on the next one.